Hi there once again and welcome to another Expresso mechanic tutorial, and this is the first in a three-part series in which we're going to be building a scissor lift. In this particular tutorial we're going to be focused on the scissor mechanism itself, so we're going to build the actual struts here, the inner and outer struts, and we'll put the top and the base in place. In the next tutorial we'll look at building the hydraulic ram here, and the cable will be created using a pose morph. We're going to be doing that. And then finally we're going to be using some Python to create the control system over here. We've got raise, lower and stop buttons, as you can see, and if we just run the timeline we've got full control over our lift just by using these buttons, and that's all controlled with Python. So that's what we're going to be doing in episode 3 of this series of tutorials. But anyway, without further ado, let's see if we can make this happen. We're going to be building this one from scratch, so the first thing we need to do is bring in some splines. We'll bring in a rectangle, we'll make it 200 by 10, and we'll switch on rounding, and we can leave that at 5 because it's absolutely what we need it to be. And as you can see, that's going to make the perfect strut, so we've got the first element in there. Next thing to do is bring in some circles. So we'll just drop that below the rectangle, and the radius needs to be 2.5. That's going to work fine for us. We'll copy this twice, and we just need to position these. So if we go into our coordinates, on the x-axis we need to make this 95, and we need to make our second circle minus 95. So they're now positioned and ready for us to do the next stage. What I'm going to do is group these and name this original splines in case we need to do any work. And then we'll copy all of these, close this up, and then we can make them editable and then say that we want to connect objects and delete. So now we've got a single spline. Moving on from here, we can hold down our Alt key and add this to an extrude. And straight away we create our object that we wish, but it's a little bit too deep. So we can make this 3.25. That's all it needs to be. And in our caps, we can put a rounding on there of say 0.2. Let's see if that's okay. Yeah, that looks good to me. And we'll leave the segments at 3. So we've created our first strut, and we can move on from here. The next step then is to bring in a null. Rename this outer struts. And then it needs to be positioned, and we need to place this at 95 on the x-axis, and we're also going to rotate it by 90 degrees so that it's facing along its z-axis towards this center point, and that's going to be important later because we're going to be using a target tag, and of course targets always target along their z-axis, so it's very important to set this up correctly. What we're going to do next is bring this down here and then copy our extrude and start renaming. So I'm going to call this front outer strut and rear outer strut for that one. And then these we can think about grouping into our null object. So they're in there, and then this one needs to be set up. Now you'll notice that the Z and X coordinates have actually swapped over. I need this to move along the world Z axis by 76.25. That needs to be positioned there. But in actual fact, you can see that I've had to use the X axis because we're grouped into the outer struts, and this is relative to the local axis here. So that's where it can be a little bit confusing, a bit disconcerting when you first see that, but that's why that's happening. Okay, so that's all set up and ready to go. Actually, before we continue, I'm just going to check the Yeah, okay, I said 76.25. It should actually be 76.75. I know this is being pedantic, but that's what I did in my original model, and I'm going to make it the same way. So, yeah, 76.75 in there. It's only a tiny change, but, you know, the devil's in the detail, as it were. But anyway, we can move on from here. If we just switch to our top view, so function 2, we can see that our outer struts here are at the outside edge of our front outer strut. What I need is for this to be at the rear. So I'm going to just take these out of here, get a hold of this, and I'm going to move it 3.25. And now it's in the correct place. Drop these back into there. And now that's fine. And you'll see why I've done that in a minute. Okay, great. So let's just move on from here. The next port of call then is to copy our outer struts, rename this inner struts, and then do some work in here. Now, we've got to turn this through 200, well, it's got to be basically turned through 270, I think. Let's have a look. Yeah, 270 degrees. And then what we need to do is move it to -95. That's fine. And also, of course, we've got to set it up correctly in its correct place. Now, what we need to do that, the actual null object, if we go into our top view, the null object is in its correct place. That's fine. So what we need to do is work with the struts and actually position these correctly. So our front struts, so look, we'll do this in the top view, I think is the easiest thing to do. Right, our front strut is going to be our rear. So let's call that rear outer strut. And that needs to be positioned at -73.25, I believe it is. Let's just see if that works. Yes. So that's now in its correct position. And rear strut needs to be renamed front outer strut, or in fact it's inner strut, isn't it? Let's make those correct. Okay, that's good. And so now our front strut, which is over there, that needs to be positioned at 0.25, or rather, well, that's got it positioned almost in the correct places. Let's just make it, it should really be I think it should be 3.25. Or minus, I beg your pardon. Yeah, is it minus? Let's have a look. -3.25. Yeah, that's where it should be. Probably, actually. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, that looks, let's have a look, see if that looks right. It can, no, it can be, I think it can be -3.75, actually, is where I think it should be. Yes, that's where it should be. Okay, so I know this is a bit pedantic, but it's worth getting it right. It's precision engineering that we're doing here, and it needs to be as correct as it can possibly be. But that looks good. That looks as if it's going to work out okay for us. Just go into our top view, just have a quick look, see what we've got. I think we can probably move. Have a look, see where we are. Is that? Yeah, that's a little bit too far over as well. Let's just move that one back to -70. Try -73 for that. Yeah, I think that's better. Just a tad of gap between them. That's much better. I think that looks good. That looks right to me now. As I say, I know it's pedantic, I know it's being fiddly and a bit precise, but sometimes it's worth it with this stuff. But yeah, that looks good to me. That looks as if that will work. Okay, so we've got our struts all sorted out and positioned, and we can think about the next step, which will be to bring another null into the scene and call it T1. And this is going to be a target. This is going to be what our struts are going to be targeted to. So let's just hit F2, go into our top view, and we can see that it's not in the correct position. We need to move it 3.25 in order to be in the correct place. And now it is positioned correctly, because if we look at our struts, they're positioned at 3.25 along the Z. So they need to be looking directly at T1, and now they will be. So that's the first thing we need to do. Moving on from here, we need a couple of cylinders. We're going to group those into T1. So we'll bring the first one in. We'll go into our object here, and in the orientation we'll put it plus Z. Its radius we're going to make 2.9, or rather 2.49. Again, I'm being pedantic here. You could make it 2.5, but you know, engineering wise, we'd need to allow some clearance, so we'll make it 2.49. Its height, let's just see. In fact, let's just take a look at its coordinates. If we go into our top view again, F2 to do that, and we make it 3.25. That places it in the correct place. And then, well, in fact, I'll tell you what, let's just go back there and zoom in on the objects. We just go to actually, it's a little bit big at the moment. Let's just make it the correct sort of size. We'll make it, say, 7 for now. I'm going to probably change that a little bit, but we'll zoom in on the object now and let's see what we've got. So, where are we? Yeah, I mean, it looks pretty good. It's not 100% correct. We can position it. Let's have a look at where its position is. 3.25 doesn't look quite right. We want to get it in between those, so let's just do it by eye just to see what it is, and then we can make it 3.5. That'll be fine. Yeah, 3.5 is good, and we can make it a little bit taller. If we make it 7.25, that'll be fine. I think that'll work great. Height segment's just 1, and we'll make it 60 in the rotation segments to make it nice and rounded. And then in the caps, we will put a fillet on it. We'll make it 0.2. And let's just see what that looks like. And that looks great. That looks fantastic, actually. Yeah, that's going to work perfectly well, isn't it? So fine, that's good. And what we'll do with the cylinder, we'll just come into our basic tab here, and we'll say automatic, and we'll make it a yellow colour so that it stands out, and that's fine. That looks good. So that can be grouped into T1, and then we can create another one. Go back again into our top view and just zoom out. We'll just hit H actually so that we can see everything. And then with this one, we just need to position this. Again, we'll do it by eye initially. We might be able to do it by numbers, but we'll just place it over here just as a basic setup. Zoom into it, just hit O to zoom into the object itself, and then we can have a look at what we've got here. So it looks as if we could say 72.25. Will that work for us? No, it won't. If we say, where was it before? So it's somewhere 70. Okay, 73. Make it 73.25 and see if that works. Yes, I would say that's perfect. Okay, great. So that's set the two of those up. So T1 is in place, and that's ready to be used. So we can place it here. And that's great. So we've completed that next stage. So the next thing we can think about doing is adding target effectors to our struts. So if we select both of those, come down to our tags, animation tags, target, we've got those two in there, and we can drag T1 as our target object. And nothing, of course, happens at the moment, but if we now move T1, our struts start to behave as we'd expect them to. Now, of course, at the moment, they're not going to be perfect because we can see that there's no motion. They need to actually move. And what needs to happen here, in actual fact, is that on the right-hand side, this needs to stay fixed, and the left-hand side needs to move. If we look at our original, if we just were to open that up again, if I go into my recent projects and I open this up, we can actually see, if we get a hold of the controller and we move that, we can see the right hand side here is completely fixed. The left hand side is the side that moves. So we've got to set that up and make that work with Expresso. And that's going to be our next task. So I'll just switch back into my tutorial scene. And I'm going to bring in a null object first. I'm going to call this controller. And that will be positioned at -95 along the x-axis. The next thing to do is bring in another null object and call this Scissor lift. And ultimately everything is going to be grouped into this, but not now. I'll give it the Expresso tag. And then we're ready to start work. First thing to do is bring in the controller, and at the output stage give it a position X. And that's ready to go from here. Now the way this is going to work, if we go into our side view, so F4, our front view actually, so by pressing function 4 and then H so that we can see everything, and we'll set the display to garage shading lines. Now our controller is set up over here and it's -95 centimeters away from the middle of the struts. So we can use Pythagoras theorem. Now if you've seen my piston tutorial, that will give you an idea of what we're going to do here, because it's the same sort of formula but with a little bit added to it to make it work correctly. So we've got our controller in the Expresso editor here, and the next thing that we can think about doing is bringing in a float function. So if we come down to calculate float function, we can bring one of those in, and the function needs to be a power 2. So in other words, we're going to raise whatever we put in this value is going to be raised to the power of 2. Now initially our value can be a constant value of 95. So we can put 95 in here, or we can bring a constant in. And for the sake of illustration, I'm going to do that. I'm going to bring a constant in and plumb it into here. And in my constants value, I'm going to put 95. Okay, so that's done that. I need to copy my float function. So I'll command drag to do that. And I'm going to put my position X into the value. I'm then going to bring in a math node. So calculate math. And its function needs to be subtract. And then I can simply plumb these two into here. So once again, it's an inversion of Pythagoras theorem that we're using, because of course we normally work with adding two values, squaring the, well, adding the two values, and then basically creating a square root of the result. And that's what we're going to do here actually, because the next thing we need to do is copy our float function again, place it over here, and then change the function to square root. And then we can plumb the output of our subtract into the value there, and we've created our square root of the two values that we've got here that we're subtracting from each other. The final step is to bring in T1, and this will be position Y. We need to put position Y at the input. So what we're using here is a formula to create our position Y of T1, of what's going on in here. And if we move this now, what we'll find is that we're actually using the controller to move our T1, our target here, up and down. And that's fine, that's great. However, we're not making any motion here. And that's what we need to do. We actually need to move our strut. Our strut needs to move along its position X. Okay, but also T1 needs to move along its position X as well, because you can see here it's not lining up. So let's just bring our controller back to 0, and then we'll think about how we're going to make that happen. Well, the first thing we need to do is add coordinates position X at the input stage of T1, so that it's ready to receive what we're going to set up in order to make it move. Now again, we can copy this constant, and again this is purely for illustration, and we can put minus 95 in here. And there's two ways that we can actually make this happen, but we'll use minus 95 initially, and we'll look at another way of doing it as well. And what we can do is bring in another subtract into here, plumb the output of our constant into the input there, and we can then plug the output of the controller, so the position X of the controller can be plumbed into the bottom input here, and we're ready to work out our next step. Now at the moment, if we get a result node and we check to see what's coming out of the subtract, let's have a quick look at what we've got in there. So we've got nothing at the moment, but if we move the controller, we can start to see, so we're getting a minus value, we're getting minus 2.2. Now that's no good to us because we want it to be a positive value. We just make that view 100% again, just move that back down. We want a positive value coming out of the subtract, so in order to do that, we can say calculate absolute to take away the sign, plumb this into there, and now we'll get a positive value. And if we plug that into the X position of T1, and now we move our controller, you can see that T1 is in the correct position. It's lining up with the outer struts perfectly. At the moment, the inner struts are not moving, and we need to set that up. That's the final stage of this. But before we do that, there is actually another way that we can do what we've done here. What we could actually do is plug this constant into the top of here and remove the absolute. You don't necessarily have to use it. I think it's a nicer way to work with this, but you don't have to do it that way. So if we wanted to, if we just unplug, well, what we'll do first, let's just bring things back to where they were. So bring the controller back to 0. If we take away the connection here, we remove the absolute, we can set this up as add, and we can simply plumb this into here. And we don't have to use this constant if we don't want to. So we can just plumb that into there. And now when we move our controller, we can see that we're getting the same result. So it's up to you. You can either do it the way I was doing it with the subtract in here and the constant plumbed into there and put an absolute in there, or you can do it this way. For the sake of using fewer nodes, we'll leave it set up as it is. Okay, so we've got that set up in there, and that's doing what we need it to do. To finish this off, what we need to do next is move over to here, and in T1 we need to add another position X at the output stage. Make it larger, and what I'll also do is make my window here a little bigger so that we can see everything. And then finally we just need to add another math add. Place this over here, and we need to add our controller's position X. So we'll just bring that down there, bring this down into here. So we need our controller's position X added to T1, the position X of T1. So if we bring that into here and bring this output and plumb it into here, that gives us what we need. And then all we need to do is bring in our inner struts, place those here, again position X at the input stage, and plumb this into here. And now you saw the struts have jumped into the correct position. And now when we move the controller, everything is working as it should be. If we go back into our 3D view, H to see that everything in there, just do a little bit of adjustment here, we can see that they're working absolutely perfectly. Brilliant. So that's working as exactly as it should do. And that's the expression that we need to make this work. That's our initial expression. There's going to be some more Expresso to make various other parts of this work, but that's what we need initially. So that's our first expression created. Perfectly simple. Okay. That's what you need to make that work. So if we close this down, we get our controller and we can think about bringing that back to where it needs to be. Now, if we bring it back to -95, we can see that that's not really any good to us, is it? Because it's not going to work like that in reality. So it's going to be something like -94. And I know, in fact, it's going to be 94.9. And that's perfect. That's the initial setup that we need for this to work. Okay. And then if we put it to, say, -47.5, which I just happen to know will work, that's going to be our maximum height. That's going to be our maximum height. And it's just about in the center. If we look at our original splines here, it's lining up with the center point of there. So that's fine. So -94.9, I think is where we said, didn't we? Okay, so great. What we could do then is add some user data to our controller, and we can set that up so that it's we can simply call it controller. Actually, that's going to be fine, and we'll leave it as a float. The interface will make a float slider. Our steps, well, before we do that, the units are going to be real. Our steps will make we can make 0.01 actually if we want to be really accurate about it. Our minimum is going to be -94.9 and our maximum -47.5. We'll make it -94.9 as the default value. Hit OK, and that's now set up in our user data. One thing we may do, just go back into there, manage user data. We can say, add a group, call this group controls, because we'll use it later. This won't be the final setup for it actually, but we'll say controls, and then what we'll do is drag that out of there and drop the controller into it. And now our user data is called controls. As I say, this controller here, this is only for what we're going to be using now. We're not going to be using it ultimately. Okay, so if we go into here now, where we've got the controller's position X, what we can do is bring in the user data. So in our controller, we can come down to controls, controller, and we can plumb this into here and into here, and we can remove, and we can actually also plumb it into there, and we can remove the position port for now. Okay, that will work. So now what we can do is shut this down, come into our controller, and we should be able to use this, and we can, and that moves everything now. It's not quite right though. Let's have a look. Why is that not quite right? Yeah, it should be set differently to that. Let's just see what we've got in there. Go into user data, manage user data, controller. What have we got? Oh, I see. My minimum is 95.9. It's wrong. It should be 94.9. And we can just set those up as well so that they're not allowed to go any further than these two values. They're clamped at those values. Yeah, so our minimum and maximum are now clamped, and that's correct. So if we OK that and we move back to there, we can only go to 94 minus 94.9. And that's fine. Everything's clamped and it's set up and works as we want it to. Great, so that's that stage set up. Now we can think about adding some more cylinders to the struts, and also we can think about moving on to make the top and the base of our scissor lift. We'll start by bringing in the cylinders. So we'll get our first one and we'll orientate that plus Z as we did before. The radius we can make 2.49 and 95. I think 95 should do for the actual height. Height segment's just 1 and 60 rotation segments, and that makes it nice and round. The next thing I'm going to do, go into my basic tab, select automatic, and once again make it a nice yellow colour so that it stands out. Moving on from here, this needs to be grouped into the outer struts, so I'll just twirl that down and then drop it in here. We can then look at its coordinates. For a start, we need to zero everything out. We'll just zero these two out. And well, this one we won't bother zeroing it out actually. What we'll do, we'll make this, which I think if we move it this way, let's just move it over that way. Yeah, we can make that 37. I think that should work out fine if we do 37. Yeah, 37 puts it in the middle, that's fine. And this we can make 0 so that it's facing in the same direction as the struts. It's at the same angle as the struts. And then all we need to do is copy this. So I'll command drag to copy, and then this needs to be set to 190, or rather 190 along the Z-axis, and that places it in the correct place along there. So if we select our front view, so F4, we can see that it's in the correct place. Moving on from here, we need to do the same thing with the inner struts. We need to put the cylinders into them too. So if we copy cylinder 1, just do a command drag to copy that into there. Once again, we can start to orientate this differently, just zero it out and get it in the correct position. So that's correct there. All we now need to do is change the rotation B to 0, and once again it's facing along the strut there. Command drag to copy it again, and what we'll do here, we've got to move it, try 190 along there, and hopefully we're in the correct position. And that's our cylinders grouped into our struts. And if we select our controller now, our user data is ready and we can move this and everything is working as it should be. So that's all good, all looking very nice. Let's just have a quick double check, just have a quick look round it, make sure that everything's in the correct planes and everything's doing what it should be doing and behaving the way it should be behaving. Yes, it's all good. So that's great. So that's got that stage complete. And we can now think about making the base and top parts of our scissor lift. Before we do that though, I'm just going to select all of our cylinders, and just for the sake of keeping things consistent, select my caps, select fillet, and give it a radius of 0.2, and that keeps it in line with everything else. So that's looking nice. Great. Now we can think about making the top and the base parts. So let's get a cube. Now this is going to be our base, so we'll make it 206 by 2 by 100. Okay, so that's there, and we should be able to put that at 37 on the Z-axis, I think. So that's 37. And let's just go into top view. Might not be quite in the right place. Let's see if it might be better at 40 actually. Yeah. 40 is looking very, very good for that. So 40 is fine. So that gives us that. It's not the right height, of course. Let's just go into our front view and move it down. We'll do this by eye. It'll be fine. Just eyeball it through to, say, about there. That should be okay. Yeah, that should do nicely. Okay, great. So that's our cube for our base done. What we'll do, if we go into our object, we can fillet it, and again we can say 0.2 and leave it at 3 fillet subdivisions. That's fine. Moving on from here, we need another cube, so we can grab a hold of one of those, and these, there's going to be a couple of these, they're going to be used as guides. So what we'll say, well, I won't rename it yet, I'll just sort its sizes out first. So it's going to be 105 by 11 by 6, and then it needs to be put in place. So let's just go into view, the top view, view 2, the top view. If we just move this into place, again we'll eyeball it, it's okay, it should be okay if we just eyeball it, and that's roughly in place. It's not 100% perfect necessarily, but it's roughly in place. Let's, in fact, what we'll do, just move it back from the edge to just so that it's just about in line with that. Should be okay, I would think, because it's got to go to somewhere around here, so that's okay. We need to make this editable, so we'll hit C to do that, and then zoom in on the object and we'll see what we're doing. Right, okay, great. So if we go into our polygon mode, we can select this inner polygon here and then do an inset on this, or an inner, it used to be called an inner extrude, of course, but it's now called an inset. The offset for that, let's just, well, make it 1 for now, and let's just apply that and see what we get. It's not quite enough, so let's go a little bit more. That's not looking too bad. Not looking too bad. Let's just go a little bit further though. Go 2.9. I think 2.9 will work actually. Yeah, 2.9 gives it a little bit of clearance. I mean, again, I'm being pedantic about it. You don't really have to be if you don't want to be. But let's just use that for now, 2.9. And what we'll do is hit D for extrude, and we can also hit function 3 so that we can see our right hand view and get a little bit closer. And what we can do now with our extrude here, we can have a quick check, see what we're doing. We'll apply that. It's not in the right direction, so we need to say -5, and it's a little bit too far, so what we can do is just bring that back. Try 4.5, -4.5, or try 4.7. No, too far, we're going in the opposite direction, so -4.3. Yeah, that'll do nicely. I think that'll work. That should look okay. I mean, you can model this in a much more detailed way if you choose to, but I think for our purposes here, this is fine. So that's good. Obviously, this doesn't have a fillet. If we wish to, what we can add is hold down our Alt key and we can just add a bevel deformer. Place that in there. We can always place it underneath the cube if we wish, or it can either be placed inside the cube or underneath it. Once this is grouped, we can probably do some work and just change this, but for now we'll put the offset as 0.2, and that should be fine for that, and our subdivisions 3 as we did before, and now it matches up with everything else, and that should look great. So yeah, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Good. Okay. So that's our first guide created. To create the second, we'll simply select it, Command drag, flip it through 180 degrees. So in our coordinates here, we're going to flip this along our rotation P. I think it's going to have to be 180 degrees around there. That should be fine. If we move that, oops, not like that. We want to move it. Let's move it into place if I can. What am I moving there? I'm at cube 1. It should move. Oh, I think I'm moving the polygon. I need to move the whole object. That's better. So that can be moved. We're going to view 2. or our top view. Just bring this over here so that it's in place. Again, you can do it by eye, it's fine. That should be okay. Let's go into view, 3D view. Let's have a quick look at what we've got there. It can be moved. Let's have a quick look, see what we've got on the other side. Okay. Front view. Let's have a quick look at what we've got. Okay, so if we get both of these cubes, they just need to move in this direction slightly so that they're just about there. I would think it'd be fine. Yeah, that all looks good. Okay, so our guides are pretty much in place and they're looking okay. So what we can do just to double check to see that everything is working okay is get our controller, go over our controls and just move this up, and let's see what we've got at this end. Is everything working okay? Right, they could possibly do with being a little bit bigger because we're eating into that, and I assume we're doing the same the other side. Yep, we are. So what we can do with our cubes then, if we get both of them, go into our polygon mode again, top view, get our rectangular selection, and we're not taking visibles only, so we can select that and we can select that, and we should be able to just bring these out until they're just on the other side of our cylinder there, and that should work fine now. Yeah, that all looks good. That's going to work, and it's okay the other side. Yeah, all good. Okay, that's great. So they're correct now and they're the correct sizes. This is the best way to do this, just eyeball it through. It's the easiest way. So that's the first little bit of that done, and we can work with our controller and everything matches up and it all works fine. Obviously we need a couple of brackets on this side to hold this in place, and that will be the next thing we need to work on. We'll get a cube, we'll make it 8 by 8 by 6 in the Z, and we'll drop our cube into our top cylinder in the outer struts here, and then we can think about looking at its coordinates. We can zero out the X and Y. The Z we won't worry about, we'll just bring this forward until it's just about in the right position, and we don't need to worry about the rotation B because I'm not leaving this in there. I'm going to drag it back out now, and you can see it zeroed out again, and that's fine. So if we go into our object here, we can see that it's got a reasonable size and it's at more or less the correct position. First thing to do then is make it editable, and we're in polygon mode, which is fine, and we can select our front and rear polygons. What we'll do is just take away visible only and click somewhere here, and that way we've selected both our front and rear polygons and nothing else. I for inset and 1.45, let's make it 1.4 and see if that's any good. Yes, I think that will work. There's a little bit of clearance around it, and that's never a bad thing. That's okay. So the next thing to do, we'll just go into Garrett, or rather not Garrett lines, just lines. And now we can see both of our selections there, and we'll select MB, or hit MB on the keyboard, and create a bridge between these 2 points, and that gives us a hole now through our cube. Change our display back to Garrett shading, and that's all set up nicely for us. So moving on from here, hold down my Alt key and hit subdivision surface, and now we've got our cube in one of those, and we can start thinking about working with it to make things into a better shape. So we'll select our edge mode, UL for loop selection, select those 2, go around to the rear and select these 2, And then all I need to do is hold down my full stop key on the keyboard, click and drag, and we create the shape that we want. And now it's all looking very good, working beautifully. So that's the first little part of our bracket done. Moving on from here, we need to switch to polygon mode again. Get our selection tool and select the bottom polygon. D for extrude, and we'll go try 1.4. It's a little bit too far. If we go 1.35 or maybe even 1.3. Yeah, 1.3 looks about right. It's just on top of the base there. That looks good. And then what we can do is go back to our selection tool, select the right hand polygon there and the left hand polygon, and then once again what we'll do is another extrude, so D for extrude, and this time I think we'll go 3.5. That should work. Yeah, it's not quite to the edge of the base, and that looks good. That looks good. Once again we'll select the edge tool, UL for loop selection, and let's see what we can do. Let's have a look. We don't want to stop at selections. We want this one for a start. Let's just change our display once again to lines. So we've got our top loop there, and we want our bottom loop. We want both of those. If we just go back to Garage shading and do this, we've got it almost the way we want it. So all we need to do now is select our edge there and its opposite number. Select that one too, and then hold down the full stop key, click and drag. And now we've created a nice looking bracket. So that's great, all looking good. Yeah, that will work nicely. I'm not going to bother with the nuts that will hold that down onto the top there, onto the base there. I don't need to worry about that. You can do that if you wish, but I'm not going to go into that level of detail with this. But that's looking great. And then to finish it off, once again, what we can do is select it and hold down, it should be Shift actually, hold down Shift and select a bevel, and that drops that under it. What we can actually do is just move it so that we get it in place there. That's what I want to see. And then in the bevel, I can look at my options here. I don't want an offset of 1, I want 0.2, and I want a subdivision of 3. So that once again, it's in line with everything else that we've done so far. And that looks really nice. You can see that's going to work really beautifully. So that's the first bracket done, the front bracket. We'll call that front bracket. And then I'll command drag to copy it, rename this one rear bracket, and then I can just eyeball this into place. So we'll move it, place it over here, and I can just have a look around the back, see where we are, and then eyeball that into place somewhere around there. I would think would be okay. We're not really going to be seeing it from the angle of view that we're going to be looking from. So that looks good. Yeah, that's going to work fine. Okay, so they're all the elements now completed to make the base. So what we can do is group them. So if we say Command G for group and call this base, we've completed that. And we can now think about copying it and creating the top and then putting that in place and making it work with the rest of our lift. But before we get there, I'm just going to change to my front view again. We can see that this may be a little bit high on the guides here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to select both of them. If we just zoom in a little bit closer. Yeah, we can see that it needs to line up. This actually needs to line up with the center of the cylinder here. So this is going to be a little bit too high. So what we'll do, if I get my selection tool and make sure that we're not selecting visibles only. If I select these, I should be also selecting the top polygon on the rear one as well, which I am. And now if we move them downwards until they're just about lining up with the center, or just a little, it doesn't matter if they're a little bit below actually, so there's a little bit of clearance. If we put them about there, I think we should be okay. So that's one little problem that we've sorted out. Yeah, that's going to work. That should be okay. We can always adjust again afterwards if it isn't. But anyway, that looks as if it's going to work. The next thing to do is copy the base and rename it top. But before we continue, I'm going to take all of the elements out of it, just drop them down here for a minute so that they're not in the thing. And then the top, we need to actually reposition. What I need to do is drop this top into this cylinder. So the top cylinder, if we go into our front view again, in fact, it's not the top cylinder, is it? It's going to be that top cylinder, I think. If I just check, yes, it is. So it should be in the outer struts, not the inner one. So drop it into the top cylinder of the outer struts. And then we can reorientate it. Now the next thing to do, zero this out, completely zero it out. And now it's in the perfect position because it's going to actually be, we're going to be using Expresso to take the global position of the cylinder and passing it to the global position of the top. That's how this is going to work. So we'll remove the top from the cylinder now, put it back under the base, select all these elements and drop them back in to the top. And now they're ready to be used. What we need to do, I'm just thinking here, have I jumped the gun a bit there? I may have done. Yes, in fact, perhaps, I'll tell you what, well, I know what to do. We'll flip this through 180 so that it's in the correct plane. And then what we need to do is remove the elements again, just take them out of there, and then reorientate that at 0. Drop them back in, and then we can move them by eye into position. We don't want to be in polygon mode, we don't want to be in object mode. So we've got those selected and we should be able to move them into position via the y-axis. If we just move them in the y-axis, let's get the movement, get the move tool, just take those off there, that's not what we want. Get the move tool and move them in the y-axis, get them all selected, move them down until they're in the correct place, which is about there. That looks good. That looks good. So now the top is in the correct position and everything is orientated correctly within it, and we can then think about giving the top an Expresso tag, which we've now got. And if we get the cylinder 1 from the outer struts and drop it in here, coordinates global position Y, drop the top in, coordinates global position Y, and we connect the two. Nothing should happen because they're in the same place. But now if we move our controller, we should find that things start to work. Well, it's not 100% perfect yet, but you can see that it is actually starting to work. It's taking its position, but there's lag. So we've got to sort that out. And that's the next port of call. One thing we can do is move our top beneath the scissor lift expression. So the order that they come in is important, but it won't completely solve the problem. If we check the controller again, we'll find that we still have a lag problem. So what are we going to do to fix it? Well, it's perfectly simple. In the priority here, we need to set this to generators. And now, if we use our controller, we'll find that we don't get the lag anymore and everything works beautifully. Perfect. So we've made our scissor lift thus far. And that's as far as I'm going to take things in this tutorial. We've achieved what we set out to, and it's all looking very, very nice and working beautifully. So we can leave it here for now. So in part 2, we're going to be putting in the hydraulic cylinder that actually drives the lift. We'll also give it, of course, a cable, and we'll put a little pump assembly in there. It'll just be a dummy object, but it would work, if, of course, if it was a real thing. So that's going to be our next port of call for the next tutorial. So I hope you've enjoyed this one, as always, and I hope that you've learned something from it that's worthwhile. And if you have, then please give the video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, then please do so. And of course, leave a comment and ring the bell. And wherever you happen to be on social media, please share the video, because all of this good stuff helps to keep the channel moving in the right direction. But anyway, please do join me on part 2 when we'll keep this thing going. And I'll see you very soon on that next tutorial.